Chapter 9 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Mr. Gorby is satisfied at last. In spite of his long walk, and still longer drive, Brian did not sleep well that night. He kept tossing and turning, or lying on his back, wide awake, looking into the darkness and thinking of White. Towards dawn, when the first faint glimmer of morning came through the Venetian blinds, he fell into a sort of uneasy doze, haunted by horrible dreams. He thought he was driving in a hansom, when suddenly he found White by his side, clad in white cerements, grinning and gibbering at him with ghastly merriment. Then the cab went over a precipice, and he fell from a great height, down, down, with the mocking laughter still sounding in his ears, until he woke with a loud cry, and found it was broad daylight, and that drops of perspiration were standing on his brow. It was no use trying to sleep any longer, so with a weary sigh he arose and went to his tub, feeling jaded and worn out by worry and want of sleep. His bath did him some good. The cold water brightened him up and pulled him together. Still, he could not help giving a start of surprise when he saw his face reflected in the mirror, old and haggard-looking, with dark circles round the eyes. "A pleasant life I'll have of it if this sort of thing goes on," he said, bitterly. "I wish I had never seen or heard of White." He dressed himself carefully. He was not a man to neglect his toilette, however worried and out of sorts he might feel. Yet, notwithstanding all his efforts, the change in his appearance did not escape the eye of his landlady. She was a small, dried-up little woman, with a wrinkled, yellowish face. She seemed parched and brittle. Whenever she moved, she crackled, and one went in constant dread of seeing a wizened-looking limb break off short like a branch of some dead tree. When she spoke, it was in a voice hard and shrill, not unlike the chirp of a cricket. When, as was frequently the case, she clothed her attenuated form in faded brown silk gown, her resemblance to that lively insect was remarkable. And, as on this morning she crackled into Brian's sitting-room with the Argus and his coffee, a look of dismay at his altered appearance came over her stony little countenance. "Dear me, sir," she chirped out in her shrill voice, as she placed her burden on the table, "are you took bad?" Brian shook his head. "Want of sleep, that's all, Mrs. Sampson," he answered, unfolding the Argus. "Ah! that's because you ain't got enough blood in your 'ead," said Mrs. Sampson wisely, for she had her own ideas on the subject of health. "If you ain't got blood, you ain't got sleep." Brian looked at her as she said this, for there seemed such an obvious want of blood in her veins that he wondered if she had ever slept in all her life. "There was my father's brother, which of course makes him my uncle," went on the landlady, pouring out a cup of coffee for Brian, "and the blood he 'ad was something astounding, which it made him sleep that as long as they had to draw pints from him afore he'd awake in the morning." Brian had the Argus before his face, and under its friendly cover he laughed quietly to himself. "His blood poured out like a river," went on the landlady, still drawing from the rich stores of her imagination, "and the doctor was struck dumb with astonishment at seeing the Niagara which burst from him, but I'm not so full-blooded myself." Fitzgerald again stifled a laugh, and wondered that Mrs. Sampson was not afraid of being treated as were Ananias and Sapphira. However, he said nothing, but merely intimated that if she would leave the room he would take his breakfast. "And if you wants anything else, Mr. Fitzgerald," she said, going to the door, "you knows your way to the bell as easy as I do to the kitchen," and with a final chirrup she crackled out of the room. As soon as the door was closed, Brian put down his paper and roared, in spite of his worries. He had that extraordinary vivacious Irish temperament, which enables a man to put all trouble behind his back, and thoroughly enjoy the present. His landlady, with her Arabian Night-like romances, was a source of great amusement to him, and he felt considerably cheered by the odd turn her humour had taken this morning. After a time, however, his laughter ceased, and his troubles came crowding on him again. He drank his coffee, but pushed away the food which was before him, and looked through the Argus for the latest report about the murder case. What he read made his cheek turn a shade paler than before. He could feel his heart thumping wildly. "They've found a clue, have they?" he muttered, rising and pacing restlessly up and down. "I wonder what it can be. I threw that man off the scent last night, but if he suspects me, there will be no difficulty in his finding out where I live. Bah! What nonsense I am talking! I am the victim of my own morbid imagination. There is nothing to connect me with the crime, so I need not be afraid of my shadow. I've a good mind to leave town for a time, but if I am suspected that would excite suspicion. Oh, Madge, darling!" he cried passionately, "if you only knew what I suffer, I know that you would pity me; but you must never know the truth. Never, never!" And sinking into a chair by the window, he covered his face with his hands. After remaining in this position for some minutes, occupied with his own gloomy thoughts, he arose and rang the bell. A faint crackle in the distance announced that Mrs. Sampson had heard it, and she soon came into the room, looking more like a cricket than ever. Brian had gone into his bedroom, and called out to her from there. "I'm going down to St. Kilda, Mrs. Sampson," she said, "and probably I shall not be back all day." "Which I hopes 'll do you good," she answered, "for you've eaten nothing, and the sea breezes is miraculous for making you take to your victuals. My mother's brother being a sailor and wonderful for his stomach, which, when he had done a meal, the table looked as if a locust had gone over it." "A what?" asked Fitzgerald, buttoning his gloves. "A locust," replied the landlady, in surprise at his ignorance, "as I've read in 'Oly Writ as how John the Baptist was partial to 'em. Not that I think they'd be very fillin', though, to be sure, he had a sweet tooth, and ate 'oney with 'em." "Oh, you mean locusts," said Brian, now enlightened. "And what else?" asked Mrs. Sampson, indignantly. "Which, though not bein' a scholar, I speaks English, I 'opes, my mother's second cousin having had a prize at his spelling bee, though he died early through brain fever, having crowded his head overmuch with the dictionary." "Dear me!" answered Brian, mechanically. "How unfortunate!" He was not listening to Mrs. Sampson's remarks. He suddenly remembered an arrangement which Madge had made, and which up till now had slipped his memory. "Mrs. Sampson," he said, turning round at the door, "I am going to bring Mr. Frettlby and his daughter to have a cup of tea here, so you might have some ready." "You have only to ask and to have," answered Mrs. Sampson, hospitably, with a gratified crackle of all her joints. "I'll make the tea, sir, and also some of my own partickler cakes, being a special kind I have, which my mother showed me 'ow to make, 'aving been taught by a lady as she nussed through the scarlet fever, though being of a weak constitootion, she died soon after, being in the 'abit of contracting any disease she might chance on." Brian hurried off, lest in her Poe-like appreciation of them, Mrs. Sampson should give vent to more charnel house horrors. At one point of her life the little woman had been a nurse, and it was told of her that she had frightened one of her patients into convulsions during the night by narrating to her the history of all the corpses she had laid out. This ghoul-like tendency in the end proved fatal to her professional advancement. As soon as Fitzgerald had gone, she went over to the window and watched him as he walked slowly down the street, a tall, handsome man, of whom any woman would be proud. "What an awful thing it are to think you'll be a corpse some day," she chirped cheerily to herself, "though of course being a great swell in his own place, you'll have a nice airy vault, which 'ud be far more comfortable than a close stuffy grave, even though it has a tombstone and violets over it. Ah! Now, who are you, impertinence?" she broke off, as a stout man in a light suit of clothes crossed the road and rang the bell. "A pulling at the bell as if it were a pump handle." As the gentleman at the door, who was none other than Mr. Gorby, did not hear her, he of course did not reply, so she hurried down the stairs, crackling with anger at the rough usage her bell had received. Mr. Gorby had seen Brian go out, and deeming it a good opportunity for inquiry, had lost no time in making a start. "You nearly tored the bell down," said Mrs. Sampson, as she presented her thin body and wrinkled face to the view of the detective. "I'm very sorry," answered Gorby meekly. "I'll knock next time." "Oh, no, you won't," said the landlady, tossing her head. "Me not having a knocker, and you and your scratching the paint off the door, which it ain't been done over 6 months, by my sister-in-law's cousin, which he is a painter, with a shop in Fitzroy, and a wonderful heye to colour." "Does Mr. Fitzgerald live here?" asked Mr. Gorby, quietly. "He do," replied Mrs. Sampson, "but he's gone out, and won't be back till the arternoon, which any message'll be delivered to him punctual on his arrival." "I'm glad he's not in," said Mr. Gorby. "Would you allow me to have a few moments' conversation?" "What is it?" asked the landlady, her curiosity being roused. "I'll tell you when we get inside," answered Mr. Gorby. She looked at him with her sharp little eyes, and seeing nothing disreputable about him, led the way upstairs, crackling loudly the whole time. This so astonished Mr. Gorby that he cast about in his own mind for an explanation of the phenomenon. "Wants oiling about the joints," was his conclusion, "but I never heard anything like it, and she looks as if she'd snap in two, she's that brittle." Mrs.